Los Angeles, California, in the mid-1990s was a city of contrasts. Skyscrapers downtown, quiet suburbs stretching into the San Fernando Valley, glittering Beverly Hills storefronts, and endless highways tying it all together. For Bruce Cleland, a 43-year-old software designer, the city was simply home. He lived a steady life, driving to work each day, often returning to his modest family house in the suburbs of San Gabriel Valley, where his parents still lived. Bruce wasn't wealthy in the Hollywood sense. He wasn't dining in Malibu or throwing parties in Bel Air, but he was comfortable. His career had given him security, a nice car, a savings account that was healthy. More than anything, he longed for someone to share it all with. His friends in Pasadena and colleagues in the tech circles of downtown LA saw him as a quiet, kind, reliable man. The only thing missing, they knew, was love. And then, in December 1995, at a casual social gathering in Los Angeles, accounts vary whether it was a friends get-together near Alhambra or a dinner outing in East LA, Bruce met Rebecca Salcedo. Rebecca, in her early 30s, had grown up in Los Angeles too, but her life and her ambitions had taken a different shape. She knew how to dress sharply, how to laugh in a way that made people feel chosen, and how to steer conversations so attention stayed on her. She was beautiful, magnetic. When she looked at Bruce that night, and when she leaned in to hear him speak, Bruce felt something he hadn't felt in years: connection. Their romance bloomed quickly. Within weeks, Rebecca was a regular presence in Bruce's life. They went on dinners along Colorado Boulevard in Pasadena, walked through the crowded shops in Glendale Galleria, and spent late nights at Bruce's apartment. Neighbors began seeing Rebecca's car in the driveway almost every evening. Bruce's parents, who lived just a few miles away in a quiet residential part of Rosemead, were introduced early, and though they smiled and welcomed her politely, they had their quiet doubts. Rebecca wanted more than dinners and movies. She talked about marriage within months. Bruce, still swept up, thought, why wait? By October 1996, less than a year after they'd met, Bruce and Rebecca were standing in the small, echoing interior of a Los Angeles County Civil Courthouse downtown. They exchanged bows quickly. Just paperwork, just a signature. But plans were in motion for a grander ceremony at a Catholic church in Pasadena the following January. On the surface, it was a fairy tale. But even before the ink on the marriage license had dried, Rebecca was already making moves behind the scenes. She pulled Bruce's credit report, asked questions about his bank accounts, and made mental notes of his assets. For her, this wasn't about romance. It was about leverage, about securing a financial future for herself. After the wedding, Bruce moved Rebecca into his home in Alhambra, a modest but well-kept place where he had lived quietly for years. Soon, though, the home began to change. Rebecca wanted new furniture, high-end decor, expensive clothing. She spent hours in shops in Beverly Hills and returned with bags of designer labels. Vacations were discussed, luxury cars admired. Bruce tried to keep up, swiping his credit card again and again. But friends noticed the stress it was putting on him. At family dinners in Rosemead, Bruce's parents whispered to each other. "She seems different," they said. "She doesn't seem interested in him, only in what he can provide." His sister noticed the same thing, watching Rebecca's sharpness when Bruce resisted a purchase or mentioned saving money. Bruce, ever the optimist, brushed it off. Sitting with colleagues in an office on Wilshire Boulevard, he defended his wife. "She's just adjusting," he said. "She'll settle in." But in his quieter moments, Driving home onto congested lanes of the I-10 freeway, doubts crept in. By early 1997, only months after their marriage, the cracks were undeniable. Arguments erupted in their home in Alhambra. Bruce would spend more nights at his parents' place in Rosemead, retreating to the familiarity of his childhood room, rather than facing Rebecca's anger and demands. He had dreamed of love, of late-night conversations in the kitchen, of planning a future. Instead, he found himself keeping receipts, bracing for the next fight over money. Friends tried to encourage him. One co-worker remembered pulling Bruce aside during lunch in Little Tokyo. "You don't look happy," he said. Bruce sighed, his fork idle on the plate. "I'm trying," he admitted, "but I don't know if it's working." Rebecca, meanwhile, showed no signs of compromise. To acquaintances in East LA, she confided her true feelings. She didn't care for Bruce. She wasn't in love. She'd marry him, take what she could, and eventually divorce. The marriage, in her mind, was a stepping stone, not a partnership. Bruce couldn't see it, or refused to. His parents, sitting at their kitchen table in Rosemead, urged him to be careful, to think. But Bruce was a man who had waited too long to give up easily. Even when he packed a bag and stayed away from home for stretches of time, he still told himself maybe things could improve. Maybe Rebecca just needed more time. But Rebecca was already thinking ahead, and not in the way Bruce hoped. Divorce would leave her with little. Widowhood, on the other hand, would leave her with everything. As spring of 1997 turned into summer, Los Angeles baked in the relentless heat. On the crowded streets of downtown, in the shaded courtyards of Pasadena, life went on. But inside Bruce's world, the tension grew heavier with each passing day. He was a man still clinging to the dream of love. She was a woman mapping out how to profit from his death. And that is where part 1 ends. The quiet streets of Rosemead and the bustling heart of Los Angeles framed a marriage that was doomed from the start. A good man, blinded by hope, had given his heart to someone who never wanted it, only his wallet and ultimately his life. By the spring of 1997, the Cleland marriage was already a shell of what it was supposed to be. In their small house in Alhambra, California, neighbors heard the raised voices. Rebecca's sharp tone carried through thin walls. Bruce's quiet, tired replies were sometimes followed by the sound of doors slamming. What had begun as a whirlwind romance had cooled into something icy, tense, and transactional. Rebecca no longer bothered to hide her frustrations. She wanted more money, more freedom, and less of Bruce. In phone calls to relatives scattered across East Los Angeles, she complained that her husband was boring, stingy, and useless. What she didn't say openly, but what she thought about constantly, was that Bruce was worth more to her dead than alive. The shift came when Rebecca learned about his life insurance policies. Bruce, like many cautious men who had lived much of their lives single, had structured his finances carefully. His employer in downtown LA provided coverage. He had supplemental plans. And after their marriage, Rebecca had been added as beneficiary. Altogether, his policies were estimated to be worth several $100,000. Money that could transform Rebecca's life. But Rebecca didn't plan to simply wait for a natural death. She began talking to her family. Among her closest confidants were her cousins, 2 young men from East LA, part of a working-class family that had seen its share of struggles. They were tied with Rebecca, close enough to listen when she spoke in conspiratorial whispers. According to testimony later, Rebecca first floated the idea half-jokingly, testing the water. If Bruce were gone, She said one night while sitting in a cousin's living room in Boyle Heights, "Things would be easier. I could move on. I'd be set." The cousins didn't laugh it off. They asked questions. How much was he worth? What would she get? And soon, what began as a complaint turned into a plan. They discussed details in hushed tones, sometimes in Rebecca's car parked along Whittier Boulevard, other times in small apartments tucked into the neighborhoods of East Los Angeles. The plan was clear. Bruce had to die, and it had to look like a random robbery. Rebecca promised her cousins a cut of the insurance money. Meanwhile, Bruce continued his life, oblivious. He worked. He saw his parents in Rosemead. He tried, sometimes, to reconcile with Rebecca. His co-workers saw him looking thinner, more distracted, but they assumed it was the strain of a marriage under pressure. Bruce never suspected that when Rebecca kissed him goodnight, she was already dreaming of his funeral. By July 1997, Rebecca and her cousins had a plan in place. The date was set. Saturday, July 26, 1997. That evening, Rebecca suggested a night out to Bruce. They'd drive into Los Angeles, enjoy a quiet evening together, maybe dinner. For Bruce, who had been living partly at his parents' home in Rosemead because of their constant arguments, it felt like a chance at reconciliation. He agreed, hopeful as always. The evening began like any other. Witnesses later recalled seeing Bruce and Rebecca together in a small restaurant not far from East Los Angeles, eating quietly, Bruce smiling faintly, Rebecca less engaged. When they finished, they got into Bruce's car, a modest sedan, and began to drive through the city streets. Unbeknownst to Bruce, Rebecca's cousins were waiting. They had been given the time and place. As Bruce drove west, into the dark stretches of streets near East Los Angeles, the cousins followed in another vehicle. At some point that night, Bruce pulled over. Accounts differ. Whether Rebecca asked him to stop for some errand, or whether the cousins forced the car to halt. But what is certain is that Bruce never saw it coming. On a dimly lit street, not far from the hum of Interstate 710, the cousins approached. A struggle followed. Bruce, blindsided, had no chance to defend himself. Gunshots rang out into the Los Angeles night. When it was over, Bruce slumped lifeless in the car. He had been killed execution style, shot at close range. His life, his dreams of love, ended on a street where he had been lured by the very woman he trusted most. Rebecca was calm. Witnesses would later recall her demeanor as almost detached. While Bruce's blood still stained the car seats, she made sure the scene appeared like a robbery gone wrong. The cousins vanished into the night, leaving Rebecca to play the role of the grieving widow. At 2 a.m. on July 27, 1997, police received reports of a shooting in East LA. Officers arrived to find Bruce's car, headlights still on, parked at the curb. Inside, Bruce's body was slumped against the steering wheel. He had been shot multiple times. The scene bore the hallmarks of street violence common in Los Angeles during the 1990s. Gang activity, random robberies, drive-by shootings. At first glance, it looked like Bruce had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Rebecca's performance began immediately. She sobbed when officers questioned her. She told them Bruce had wanted to drive through East LA, that she begged him not to, that they had been targeted randomly. To police hardened by years of violent crime in the city, her story seemed plausible. After all, East Los Angeles in the late 90s was marked by high crime rates. A shooting wasn't unusual. Bruce's parents in Rosemead received the call before dawn. His mother's scream echoed through their quiet home. His father, in shock, drove to the Los Angeles County morgue to confirm his son's body. They were devastated, unable to understand how their kind, gentle son had become the victim of senseless violence. Rebecca, meanwhile, played her part well. She attended the funeral at a Catholic church in Pasadena, dressed in black, crying in front of mourners. She clutched tissues, whispered about how cruel fate had been. To Bruce's parents, something about her tears felt wrong, forced, but they were too consumed by grief to voice it. Within days, Rebecca began asking questions about Bruce's life insurance. She called the companies, checked policies, pushed paperwork. To those who knew her, it was unsettling. Her husband's body was barely cold, yet she seemed more focused on payouts than mourning. But to the insurance companies, it was routine. Spouses often handled affairs quickly. Nothing seemed amiss. But detectives in Los Angeles were not entirely convinced. Something about the scene nagged at them. The supposed robbery hadn't made sense. Bruce's wallet, though rifled through, was still present. His car wasn't stolen. The shooting was precise, execution style, not wild like many gang-related killings. And Rebecca's demeanor, when stripped of theatrics, seemed too composed. Over the following weeks, detectives from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department began quietly investigating. They revisited the crime scene in East LA, interviewed residents, and traced Rebecca's movements. They learned she had been in frequent contact with her cousins in the days leading up to the murder. Phone records told a story of planning, of coordination. Slowly, the web began to unravel. For Bruce's parents, who sat in their modest home in Rosemead every evening, staring at their son's photos, the truth would soon surface. Their daughter-in-law, the woman they had never quite trusted, was not a grieving widow at all. She was the architect of their son's death, and so, as summer 1997 wore on in Los Angeles, a case that at first looked like random street violence began to shift. Investigators now whispered among themselves, this wasn't just another tragic East LA murder. This was a conspiracy, born of greed, carried out in cold blood, and tied directly to the woman who had promised to love Bruce Cleland until death. For weeks after Bruce Cleland's murder in East Los Angeles, Rebecca Salcedo played her role as the grieving widow. She stayed with relatives in Alhambra, spoke softly about her pain, and attended gatherings where people tried to comfort her. But beneath the surface, investigators from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department were piecing together a far darker picture. From the beginning, certain details bothered detectives. The so-called robbery on that July night in 1997 seemed staged. Why hadn't the killers taken the car? Why hadn't they stripped Bruce of valuables? And why did the shooting look so deliberate, so clinical? It wasn't the messy chaos of a gang shooting. It was precise, controlled. The red flag grew brighter when detectives discovered how quickly Rebecca pursued Bruce's life insurance policies. Less than a week after his funeral mass at a small church in Pasadena, she was on the phone with insurance companies, pressing for payout information. She visited their offices in downtown Los Angeles, carrying documents, asking about processing times. Grieving wives, investigators knew, often struggled even to get out of bed. Rebecca, however, seemed focused, determined, businesslike. Detectives began tracing her phone records. Calls to her cousins spiked in the days before and after Bruce's death. Neighbors in Boyle Heights reported seeing Rebecca parked outside late at night, talking with her cousins. What could they have been planning? The breakthrough came when one of Rebecca's cousins, nervous under questioning, began to crack. At first, he denied involvement, but when detectives presented him with call logs, surveillance sightings, and timelines, his story wavered. Finally, in an interview room at the sheriff's East LA station, he admitted the truth. Rebecca had asked him and another cousin to kill Bruce. In exchange, she promised them a share of the insurance money. That confession was the unraveling thread. Within days, the sheriff's department had enough to move. On a late summer morning in 1997, deputies arrived at Rebecca's residence in Alhambra with an arrest warrant. She was taken into custody. Stunned, her act of widowhood collapsing in the bright California sunlight, news of her arrest spread quickly, shocking Bruce's friends and co-workers who had believed her story of tragic street violence. In jail, Rebecca maintained her innocence. She insisted she was being framed, that her cousins were lying to save themselves. But the evidence mounted: phone records, testimonies, financial documents. The prosecution in Los Angeles County Superior Court painted a damning portrait. Rebecca was a manipulative woman who married a kind man not for love but for money. And when she realized she could not control him, she orchestrated his murder. The trial drew attention across Los Angeles in 1999. Reporters filled the courthouse on Temple Street. Sketch artists captured her calm, polished appearance as she sat at the defense table. The defense argued that Rebecca was being scapegoated by her cousins, that they had acted alone, and that she had nothing to do with it. But the cousins' testimony was powerful. One after another, they described how Rebecca had approached them, how she had dangled the promise of life insurance payouts, how she had set the stage for Bruce's death. Jurors listened as prosecutors described the final night. They heard how Bruce, hopeful for reconciliation, had driven through East LA with his wife by his side, how Rebecca had delivered him into the hands of his killers, and how she had later cried crocodile tears at his funeral while plotting to collect hundreds of thousands of dollars. Perhaps the most heartbreaking moment came when Bruce's parents testified. His mother described the last meal they'd shared together in their modest Rosemead home, how her son had been quiet but hopeful about his marriage. His father, voice-breaking, recounted the call from the coroner, the drive to the LA County morgue, the sight of his son's lifeless body. "We trusted her," his father said, looking across the courtroom at Rebecca. "She married our son, and then she destroyed him." The jury deliberated for days. In the end, they returned with a guilty verdict. Rebecca Salcedo was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The cousins who had cooperated with the state received lengthy sentences but avoided the harshest penalties. For Rebecca, however, the weight of her crime fell heavy. The judge sentenced her to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. As deputies led her away from the Los Angeles courtroom in shackles, Rebecca showed little emotion. Reporters noted she held her head high, as if defiance were the only thing left she could cling to. But the mask of the grieving widow was gone. She was now a convicted murderer, a woman whose greed had extinguished the life of a man who had given her nothing but love. For Bruce's family, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but not closure. They returned to their Rosemead home with photographs and memories. Not their son. His mother said in an interview outside the courthouse, "Bruce was gentle, too gentle. He believed in love, even when it was false. That was his gift, and it was his curse." In prison, Rebecca faded from headlines. She was transferred to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, far from the Los Angeles streets, where she had plotted her husband's death. Life behind bars was a stark contrast to the luxury she had once demanded. No jewelry, no expensive clothes, no freedom, just a cell and a lifetime to think about the choices she had made. The case of Bruce and Rebecca Cleland remains one of those tragic Los Angeles stories that combines love, betrayal, and greed. For Bruce, it began as a dream, meeting a woman he thought would complete his life. For Rebecca, it was never about love at all. It was about money, status, and escape. Their marriage lasted less than a year, ending not in divorce, but in bloodshed on a lonely East LA street. Looking back now, the story feels almost like a warning about the dangers of blind trust, about the predators who walk among us, smiling, charming, wearing the mask of affection, and about how one man's longing for love collided with one woman's hunger for wealth, creating a tragedy that scarred families, destroyed lives, and left a permanent stain on the streets of Los Angeles.